So today we are lucky enough to be joined by Lindsey Andronak, apologies, a research technician with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Lindsey works at the Canada-Manitoba Crop Diversification Centre in Carberry, Manitoba, and she focuses on potato production. Lindsey holds an M.Sc in Soil Science from the University of Manitoba and is the chair of the Soil and Land Use Committee, as well as for the Manitoba Envirothon. Today, Lindsey is going to be speaking with us about soil fertility and how it relates to growing crops. Lindsey, you can take control of the screen now.
All right, great. Can everyone see me? Yes. So, just share my screen here. Yep. All right. So, today I'm going to be talking about soil fertility, just a brief overview because soil fertility is such an immense topic. It's going to be a little strange for me presenting and sitting down at the same time. I don't think I've ever done that before. So if you do have any questions during the presentation, feel free to just type them into the text box, and Allison, feel free to interrupt me with a question at any time. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is, why do we care about soil fertility? And specifically, why do farmers care about soil fertility? Although soil fertility definitely affects all of us. There are three main reasons, those being economic, social, and environmental. So the first reason is economic. So clearly, farmers, that's their job. That's their livelihood, is to produce crops to feed us. So to produce crops, they expect to get some money in return. So the more yield they can produce, the more money they get, theoretically. And that helps the entire economy, not just farmers, but a lot of Canada's economy is based on agricultural trade. So when farmers are applying fertilizers, if they apply too much fertilizer, they are wasting money because fertilizer is not free, it does cost money. Which will then reduce the bottom line. Or if they apply too little fertilizer, they could be missing out on some potential yield and therefore also missing out on some net returns. So some things to think about. There's also the social factor. So a lot of farmers aren't in it just for the money. Producing food is extremely important. I'm sure we've all had lunch today. I know I did. And that lunch was provided to us indirectly from farmers. So to produce enough food for Canada, as well as a substantial portion of the rest of the world, there's those social factors as well. So if we can optimize our soil fertility, we can better feed Canada and the world. There's also the environmental factor. So when we overuse fertilizer, not only is it an economic deficit to the farmers, it is also can create environmental problems. So for example, you guys are in Ontario, so I found this picture of Lake Erie on my screen there, and that is an algal bloom in Lake Erie. We have the same problem here in Manitoba with Lake Winnipeg, and one of the reasons, there are many factors that cause these blooms that can affect all of the lake ecosystem, but one of the factors has been found, phosphorus runoff from fields. So if you overapply phosphorus, you may end up with this problem. There are also other numerous factors that I won't get into that can cause these problems, but so it's not only farmers' faults, but they can contribute to this problem. Other problems with nitrogen leaching, you can get something called blue baby syndrome where it contaminates the groundwater. So it's important to think about these from an environmental standpoint as well. So soil fertility is made up, basically, it's different nutrients found in the soil that help to feed the plants on a civil basis. So we have our macronutrients, and macronutrients are nutrients that plants require in larger amounts. So those are things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. Then we also have our micronutrients, which are still just as important as macronutrients, but they are required in smaller amounts. So those are things like calcium, magnesium, manganese, boron, zinc, copper, and iron. And a common thing that you may have heard of in chemistry class, I'm not sure when you get taught this, or maybe it will be first year university, I can't remember, what happens when you do too much school, you don't remember when you learn things. It's called Liebig's law of the minimum. So it's commonly kind of portrayed by a barrel. So the different slats on the barrels are the different nutrients. So the minimum one is the limiting nutrient. So as soon as you hit your limit on that nutrient, you notice you cannot fill up the bucket anymore because it'll just run down the side here. So commonly in a cropping environment, that limiting nutrient is going to be nitrogen. However, with Liebig's law of the minimum, if you were to increase your nitrogen amount and make this slat bigger, so if it came up over here, you'll notice that then you'll find you'll have another minimum over here. So the trick is to get the maximum yield is you want the slats to have, a relatively equal concentration. I mean, of course, they're not going to be you're not going to be putting the same amount of each nutrient in the soil, but you don't want to have necessarily a limiting nutrient. So where do plants get their nutrients from? The main source that they get their nutrients from is actually the soil. So you may have heard talk about hydroponics, plants that can grow without soil. That is possible where they get their nutrients through water. However, on a large scale, on a large farming scale, right now it is just not practical, and we definitely need those nutrients from the soil to produce all of our crops. Now, one of the problems with modern agriculture is that we have a disruption of the nutrient cycle. So when we grow crops, we harvest those crops and we feed people. Oftentimes these people are centered in an urban area. So what happens is you're taking those nutrients out of the farmland, you're transporting them in food to the urban area. And instead of getting returned to the soil in waste products, like feces and urine, they're actually just getting flushed down into whatever kind of system you have. So, your sewage system. And most of the times these are lost and not actually returned to the place they were from. So if that happens over and over again, essentially what's happening is we're mining the soil, and that fertility from the soil is being lost. When you have something like a grazing system, so you have cattle, for example, grazing on forage crops, so grasses, they're actually defecating back onto the field. And that's what's happening, and the nutrients are being recycled. So because we have this disruption of the nutrient cycle, we often need to supplement our crops with additional nutrients. So those would come from fertilizers, both chemical and organic, as well as manure. So how do we know how much to feed the plants? I said, before that we don't want to add too much. We also don't want to add too little. So how do we know how much plants need? So I put a few links so we can kind of switch over here, and we can see the International Plant Nutrition Institute has a bunch of different. There's web-based calculators. There's also an app, so you can look at what specific plant you're looking at, and then you can see the uptake and removal. So there's a few. This Western Canada also has some. So you can see there's a range for each nutrient. There's a range of their uptake. So uptake is what the plant needs to grow. So if you look at spring wheat for 40 bushels an acre, you're looking at around, we'll say, 85 pounds of nitrogen per acre. There's also this removal, and that's how much you're actually removing when you harvest the crop, because of course when you remove the crop, things are still left on the field. So things like stubble and roots aren't being removed. So these are all, you'll see a lot of places have different, so you'll have from oats to oil seeds to your pulse crops to different forages. So they all have different uptake and removal rates.
So Lindsey, we had a question, and I thought maybe we'll just pop in and ask it then.
Yes, that would be perfect.
Ben was wondering what the difference is between chemical and organic fertilizers.
So chemical fertilizers are man-made. So they're things that are made in the factory, Whereas we have organic fertilizers are things that were found kind of naturally. So, for example, for phosphorus, you could use something like monoammonium phosphate. That's produced in a factory. Or you could use phosphate rock, which is essentially a rock that breaks down and produces phosphorus. So the main difference between using those is that when you use something like phosphate rock, it can take a long time for it to break down and have the phosphorus become available. So it's not overly practical if you're expecting to use that phosphorus in the next growing season. Depending on where you are located, it can take years for that phosphorus to become available. Whereas a chemical fertilizer, you put it on, it's available that year, which is why most farmers use chemical fertilizers. Of course, except if they're in organic production, they're not able to use those. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, so those are just some different values for different, so it's kind of, you can figure out, it's almost like a recipe, how much you need to add in pounds per acre for the different crops. So this is easily, you can find this easily online. There's a whole bunch of different websites and information. We have this, I usually use the Manitoba Soil Fertility Guide, but they're basically, uptake values are basically the same no matter where you're located. So it's a pretty general. And the other thing you want to make sure is that whatever your yield is, you can easily adjust these values using some simple math in case you want to increase or decrease your expected yields. So that's just some kind of some background information for you guys if you're ever figuring this out yourself. So we kind of figure out how much a plant needs per year. Now we need to know how much we need to add. So it's a pretty simple, well, it's a very basic equation I made. So you have the nutrient requirement. So that's what I showed you with the uptake values in the previous slides. But as we know, the soil, we're not starting from scratch. There's always some nutrients left in the soil. So you don't want to over-fertilize. If you have a certain amount in soil, you can use that towards your total nutrient requirement. And then you will also need to, in general, especially in Western Canada, supplement at least some of the nutrients. So that's either with fertilizers or manure. So how do we figure out how much we have in soil? So the best way to do this is a soil test. There are formulas and stuff that you can try and figure this out without a soil test, but really if you want more accurate results, you're going to want to do a soil test. So you can either hand sample with an auger. This takes a bit more time and brute strength. Helps if you have a bunch of people to kind of help out. Or you can do a mechanical one with, this is called the Giddings machine. So it's essentially just kind of this probe fit onto hydraulics, and it basically pumps it down into the soil for you. You also have to figure out when is the best time to soil test. If you want to do it in the fall, obviously before it freezes, or if you want to do it in the spring. And we'll discuss that a little bit further, which method may be the best, depending on how you're doing it. So once you're done soil sampling, you'll send it off to a lab and you'll get the soil analysis report example. And what you'll see is they'll send you back all your different levels. So you'll have the organic matter. Sorry, this isn't as clear as I would like to be. It's hard to find a good one. There's phosphorus, potassium. They have all the different nutrients, and they'll tell you the amounts that you have in your soil already. So you can use that in your equation to figure it out. Also, sometimes I work at a research facility, so I don't have access to fertilizer recommendations. But if you're a farmer and you fill out your crop for next year, as well as your yield goal, lots of labs will provide you with soil fertility recommendations that you can use to help you decide how much you want to fertilize your soil. So there's a few methods for going out and soil sampling, because the data they can provide you is only as good as the soil or the material that you give them. So there's a few different sampling methods that we commonly use. The first one is called, this is my lovely diagram that I worked very hard on, it's called a traditional composite random. So basically this is your field right here. And then I've delineated a few areas. So this is a known saline area, and this is kind of a sandier ridge. So with the traditional composite random, you want to take about, each X represents a sample point. You want to take about 15 to 20 samples in a field, you want to avoid the known areas that are different, and then you'll just get an average value for the entire field. So that's generally the easiest method and the method that is used the most because it's more time efficient, and also soil sampling is expensive when you pay. You have to pay per sample. So this kind of gives you a general look at the entire field, so it's more cost effective. Then the next one is benchmark sampling. So you'll divide it up into different areas. So you can see here, this would be a sampling area here in the saline area. This is just kind of in the middle here. Then we have one in the sandy ridge, and then we have one in this corner right here. So you would actually take 15 to 20 samples in each of these benchmark areas. And then what you would do is you would send them all in separately. So when you looked at the previous slide, what you would get from this, you'd be getting one value back from the lab. Whereas when you look at the next one, the next slide, this benchmark, you'd be getting 4 different values. And then you would be able to treat each of these areas differently with different fertilizer recommendations. So again, the cost is a bit more and you are taking more samples, but it may be worth it. This also works really well if you GPS these points and you come back to the same benchmark points every year. It's great for monitoring how your field is changing over time and whether your fertilizer prescription is really working the way you want it to. So the next one is a grid. So this is commonly used in research. We'll do grid sampling sometimes. It gives you a really good, it's quite intensive sampling. So you'd be taking, at each of these points, you'd be taking, I don't know, 5 to 10 samples throughout this grid. And then you would be sending each of these samples in individually and then getting your result back. And you could actually grid out this whole map. So for most farmers, this isn't really a practical way of doing it. It's too much sampling and it's too much expense because you'd be submitting 16, say, samples in this area. But if you ever look at soil test reports, or if you look at your soil survey data, that's often they have done grid sampling, and it's very, very detailed. So usually a bit too detailed for most farmers' work. Then we have landscape directed sampling. So that's where I've divided up. We have the saline area. So we take 15 points from the saline area, for example. We put them all together, get those tested. We take 15 points, say, from the sandy ridge. We get this all sampled and put all together. We get a value back for that one. And then we would also do the other main part of the field, and we would sample those all together. So we get 3 back. But this really is only useful if you're going to manage these areas differently. So if you just put all the fertilizer on the same, then there's no point in doing a landscape directed. But if you decide to manage each of these areas of the field differently, then it's definitely a good way to go. I think we had a question. I don't know how to get back to the, oh, here we go. All right.
I was going to say, Lindsey, it's Lisa asking if it's mandatory for organic and conventional soils being used to grow crops destined for consumers to be tested, for the soil to be tested, and what happens if the farmer does find a nutrient deficiency in the soil?
All right, so that's a really great question. It's not mandatory at all for farmers to soil test. In Manitoba, we actually have regulations. We've had a lot of issues with pork production and way too much phosphorus on our land. So we have had issues where you can actually be fined if you're putting too much phosphorus on your land. And the only way to know that is to soil test. So that's kind of a method. But as far as it actually being illegal or any concerns, our food is often not tested for nutrients. So it's kind of almost a free-for-all. Whatever's grown is just what you get in the store. Some specific crops, so when you're looking at, ironically, beer, the barley that they use for beer is actually pretty strictly tested because protein content is quite important. And as well as some wheat. So especially when we're looking at different flours, protein content is really important. But as far as general nutrients goes, they're not. So For example, I was reading this article. Now I don't have it on me, obviously, but apparently the amount of like vitamin C in our oranges is decreasing over time because there's less precursors to vitamin C in the soil. So that's another thing, that sometimes maybe the food that we're eating, if the landscape is not properly soil sampled and fertilized, it could be decreasing. So that's a problem that people are becoming more concerned about, but there are no federal or provincial regulations at this time to cover that. Does that answer your question? And I saw we had another question.
We actually had two, Lindsey.
Okay.
What was the second sampling method?
Okay, so it's benchmark. And I think Allison said that she would be throwing this up online after.
Yeah, if you're willing to share, I will be posting it.
Yes, so you can go back to that and see that later. What was the other question?
The other question was asked, Aileen was asking, what would a qualification be for retiring marginal land versus trying to rehabilitate it? So like at what point would you decide that saline area isn't worth trying to manage?
So a lot of times it would come back to the economics. If you're putting on more fertilizer on your land and you're not getting that return on crop investments, most farmers will retire the land. There's also programs, I know in the States they have they used to, I'm not sure, I haven't really been keeping up with this, but they used to have for more marginal land, especially with wetland areas. And I think Ducks Unlimited is still doing that program too. It's called conservation easements. Well, they'll pay the farmers a certain amount of money to restore the land or leave it alone back to its original state. So oftentimes that will happen on marginal land, and that can also kind of help determine the economics of what you're doing. So hopefully that makes sense. So I can't give you a certain definition on when it's better to just retire the land than to farm it. But ideally, if you're taking good care of your land year after year, you shouldn't really reach that part unless you started on marginal land. If you just keep on mining it without returning anything back into the soil, then you can run into some problems there. So there's a lot of other factors, though, to consider as well when you're soil sampling. There's things like depth. Generally, you want to hit a 60 centimeter, or oftentimes you'll see 24 inches depth when you're sampling. That's especially important for nitrogen and sulfur because they are very mobile in the soil. And that's what's generally considered the plant extractable zone. There's also sample timing, which I mentioned, so fall versus spring. The ideal time in the fall would be to sample a few days before freeze up. Now, the problem with that is nobody knows when freeze up is going to happen. So you kind of have to hope that you're kind of hitting it at a good point. If you do it too early in the fall, you will sometimes end up seeing additional nutrient loss from your field that you don't account for, especially with nitrogen. That can be a problem. And spring would be an ideal time to soil sample, but most farmers don't soil sample in the spring because there's just not enough time to get those samples to the lab and then get their information back and to plan out for their fertilizer costs and then buy the fertilizer and all those steps. So oftentimes you'll end up sampling in the fall. You also have to look, organic matter can be quite a big, especially in Manitoba where I'm from, we have a lot of organic matter in our soils. So that can be quite a large component of soil health, as well as adding some nutrients into the soil. So on your soil report, they'll usually test for soil organic matter, and that's something to consider, as well as residue management. So your previous crop and the residue on the soil, if you're incorporating that into the soil, this can get a bit complicated, but sometimes it can increase the amount of nitrogen in your soil, but also sometimes depending on what kind of residue it is, if it's higher in carbon or higher in nitrogen, it can actually decrease the amount of nitrogen that's available. So some other factors to consider. And the organic matter and the residue management from your previous crops can actually help increase the nutrients in your soil so you don't have to add as much fertilizer. Once you decide that you are going to be adding fertilizer, you have to think about the source, the placement, as well as the timing of your fertilizer. So you have to think about the type of the fertilizer or manure you're going to be using. There's a bunch of different types of fertilizer. I won't really be getting into them. It's a little bit beyond what you guys probably need to know, but just basically to know the different types of fertilizer have different concentrations of the nutrient in them, as well as different efficiencies. So those are things that need to be considered. As well as you have manure. So your nutrient concentrations from a cow are not going to be the same from a chicken. So that's something to think about as well. Also, they're not going to be the same from a dairy cow as from beef cattle. And they're also not going to be the same from maybe a dairy cow from one person's farm to another person's farm. They could also have different nutrient concentrations. They even might be different from between two cows on the same farm. So a big difference between fertilizing with fertilizer and fertilizing with manure is when you get your bag of fertilizer, this is chemical fertilizer, it says right on there, 23% nitrogen. So you can easily calculate how much nitrogen you're putting on. With the cow, unless you go and send that out to get tested, they have general guidelines about approximately how many nutrients are being expelled from the cow. But again, you're not 100% sure. So you might be over or under fertilizing based on that. All right, so timing. I kind of discussed that too. What happens if you apply, I talked about timing when you look at when you're sampling. Some people like to fertilize in the fall, and that is a possibility. However, that gives you more time where there could be nutrient loss from either runoff or from things like denitrification, which is like off-gassing. Let's see, I got a question here that says, is there evidence that soil nutrient concentrations are closer to desirable methods when permaculture methods are being practiced versus monocrops? So it's not so much necessarily nutrient concentrations, but you definitely have better soil health in general with permaculture methods. I think basically, usually if you have permaculture, you're looking at something like a grazing system, so you will get that return of nutrients. Monocrops, you don't get that. But if we look at something in the middle with a crop rotation, which I think maybe is what you might be meaning, basically what's nice about a crop rotation is it's kind of like, you should have a good variety in your diet. Even if you're eating something healthy, if you eat only apples, you're going to be missing out a lot of nutrients. It's the same with the soil. If the soil just gets planted to potatoes every year, it's missing out on those other, not even nutrients, but other kind of chemical compounds and microorganisms that it could get from other ones. Okay, here's another great question. The pros and cons of chemical fertilizer versus manure. So as I mentioned before, chemical fertilizer is great because you know the concentration. You know exactly what you're putting on. Manure is a bit more difficult because you're not sure all the time what you're putting on. You have to get it tested, as well as when you go to the store and you buy your fertilizer, you can buy just nitrogen. You can buy just phosphorus. You can buy just potassium. Whereas manure, you're getting the whole package. So you're getting, the manure has nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur in it, which sounds great, but the problem is the concentrations, the relative concentrations, might not be correct. So that's the problem that we've been running into in Manitoba. I'm not sure about Ontario, but when farmers apply manure, they're applying it at the rate of nitrogen the plants need. But when they're doing that with manure, they're over applying the phosphorus, and therefore there's too much phosphorus, and that's when we're getting the runoff, and that's leading to problems in our water bodies. Manure is great because it's cheap, generally. The problem is though, there's a lot of water in manure, so as far as shipping it places, it's not economic to ship it very far because you're basically paying to ship water, and the farmers don't want to do that. So if you're by, or if you have animals on your farm, or you buy, a farm with animals, that's great. But as far as shipping it from place to place, it's not very economical. All right, so then Lisa says she was thinking more of biodiversity in the same area, possibly contributing a great variety of nutrients versus crop rotation or monoculture. I guess that could happen. I'm not really sure. I don't have a lot of knowledge about permaculture methods. I guess it could happen. I don't think nutrients would be the main effect, but it would probably be more all the different the other chemicals that are important. So the other things like, you know, amino acids and those kinds of, when the nutrients kind of get formed into other enzymes and metabolites, would probably be more important, because the nutrient varieties are basically the same in every plant. You don't have a lot of variability there. But yeah, it would help with other different things that could contribute to soil fertility. So yeah, as I mentioned, you can put your fertilizer on in the fall. You may get loss. You can put your fertilizer on in the spring. You could still maybe get lost if you put it on too early in the spring. But, you know, depending on how things work, it might work out quite well. Lots of farmers like to put their fertilizer down with the seed or just before the seed. And that can be a really effective way to do it. You just have to be careful. You don't want to put too much fertilizer directly with the seed, because fertilizer in high amounts can be toxic. So that's to the seeds. So that's another thing to think about. All right. So placement. So there's a few different ways that you can put the fertilizer on the field. You can broadcast it, and broadcast just means kind of spreading it out all over the field. And there's broadcast with incorporation. So that's where you would broadcast it, spread it all out, and then till it into the field, so mix it all in. There's also without incorporation, where you just leave it on the top of the field. So of course, when you think about that, the without incorporation, you're not mixing it in. It's, you know, susceptible to wind erosion and water erosion. So it may not be as available to the seed. It's also on the surface, which is not where the seed is. You can also band it. So that's basically putting it in a more concentrated line. You can do that with the seed. You have to just be careful that you're not putting too much. Otherwise, you could damage the seed. There's side row, mid row. So those are just a bit farther away from the seed. So oftentimes farmers will put some with the seed, and then also some like in the mid row, so it's farther away. So if we look at nitrogen, for example, you can see how the timing and placement really affects the efficiency. So spring broadcast will give you an efficiency of, say, this is relative, so say 100%. So that's like basically saying for every 1 pound of nitrogen you put down on your field, the plant will have approximately 1 pound of nitrogen to use. For spring banded, that's even better. It's 120%. So it's kind of like you even have more available to the plant. Fall broadcast, not great. We're down to 80%. And then fall banded is back at 100%. So that just shows you the difference. So clearly the best method, if possible, to use for efficiency is the spring banded. Again, it has to do a lot with timing and things, so just some things to think about. How much time do I have left, Allison?
We have about 20 minutes right now.
Okay. So now I'll talk to you about the different nutrients and why they are important. So the first one is nitrogen. I'm sure you've learned this all about this in biology class, but they're basically used for the same thing in plants as they are in humans. So they're used for enzymes, amino acids, which then form proteins. They're also used in nucleic acids, so that's what forms our RNA and DNA. So it's very important. Nitrogen is usually the nutrient that crops need the most of, and it's usually the limiting factor to growth. So when you're looking at deficiency symptoms for nitrogen, you have poor growth, clearly, as well as yellowing. That's particularly in the older leaves, and that's because nitrogen is mobile in the plant. So if the plant's running low on nitrogen, it can move its nitrogen from the older leaves to the newer leaves, the newer growing leaves. So that's why you'll see yellowing in the older leaves. And you'll also see low protein content, which can be a serious issue depending on what you're growing your wheat for. That's one of the few things that is tested for by wherever you sell your wheat to. For example, they do check for protein content. They also check for protein content in things like soybeans as well. So depending on if you have low protein content, you can be docked, like they dock off cents per bushel, depending on your protein content. Or sometimes they won't accept it at all for human consumption, and then it'll get sent to the feed market. So those are things to think about. All right, the next one is phosphorus. So phosphorus is very important as well. It's used for energy and ATP. It's also an important structural component of cell membranes, and it's used a lot in growth and metabolism regulation. So clearly with not enough phosphorus, you get poor growth and delayed maturity. You'll get dark green leaves because what happens is the plant has more than enough chlorophyll, which is what causes the green color, but it's not growing fast enough, the actual leaf. So you'll get a concentration of chlorophyll in the one leaf, and that's why you get really dark green leaves. You can also sometimes see a red or a purple plant as well. The next one is potassium. So potassium is used in a lot of enzymes again. It's also important for water use. So potassium is a salt, and it's one of the main salts that plants use to control things like osmotic pressure and turgor. So that's just kind of the opposite of wilting if a plant is turgid. It's used also in energy production again, so ATP. Deficiency symptoms are slow growth. You can also see lodging. So lodging is common in grasses. That's basically where the plant falls over. And that will happen because there's just not enough turgor, there's not enough osmotic pressure, the plant kind of can't stand up by itself, so it falls down. There's reduced disease resistance, and there's also wilting as well. So that's again from the water use. And what's interesting is that I mentioned how nitrogen, you know, if you have deficiency symptoms, you get slow growth. But if you have too much nitrogen in your soil, the plant takes up too much nitrogen, especially in grasses, you can also get lodging because the protein makes, especially the seed head, too heavy, and then it'll fall over. So another thing to think of, you can often get problems if you over fertilize as well. So things like lodging and also toxicity you can see from, especially when the plants are younger. All right, so the last one I have here is sulfur. So sulfur is used in amino acids and proteins. It's also used in chlorophyll, as well as if you have an oil seed, so those are things like soybeans or canola, it's very important in oil formation. So deficiency symptoms, you get poor growth. Sometimes you will get a seed set, so on your canola or your soybeans that doesn't kind of fill with oil, so basically you can't sell that. You get yellowing, mostly on the younger leaves because sulfur is not mobile in the plant. So unlike the nitrogen, which the plants can move from the older leaves to the younger leaves that need it, they can't do that with sulfur. So you see the yellowing on the younger leaves. You also get a lower quality protein. However, they don't test for the quality of the protein. It's only basically the nitrogen content, which they use kind of as kind of how they figure out your protein content. So that doesn't really ever show up on when you're bringing your crop into the bin. So that's another thing. And what's interesting about sulfur is one of the most variable nutrients in the soil. So I was actually just working on doing my own fertilizer recommendations for our crops this afternoon. And we had very high levels of sulfur in all of our fields, which can be quite common in Manitoba. We often don't add sulfur fertilizer, but I still recommended to put 10 pounds of sulfur per acre for our canola crop, because if that crop runs out of sulfur, basically it can grow the entire season and it looks great, and then when you go to harvest it, there are no seeds, which basically you spent all that time growing a crop that essentially is useless. So as kind of an insurance policy, we'll often put an extra 10 pounds because sulfur is so variable in the field. If you hit when you're sampling, doing any kind of sampling, your grid or your benchmark, if you hit a spot that's really high in sulfur, it can throw off your entire average. So just as an insurance policy, we often like to add for oil seeds that just extra 10 pounds to kind of make sure that we're good to go with that. Yeah, so low quality protein, the question here is, does low quality protein mean protein content? So it's not the exact same. It's kind of, protein content is the amount of protein, whereas the protein quality is kind of, I guess, like the grade of how good the protein is. I'm not a food scientist, so I'm not 100% sure how they just determine low quality protein versus high quality protein. But I know that it does affect just the general quality, although it doesn't end up affecting the price that they receive at the bin or anything. But again, if you're looking at things for how this affects consumers, it could greatly affect them because there is no testing for that. All right, so I think that's all I had to present today. So if anyone has any other questions or wants me to clarify anything, that would be awesome.
Hey, Lindsey, I did have one question
okay.
From watching the presentation. So thank you for delivering that. It was very interesting. I was wondering specifically on the one slide you talked about placement. I was wondering if manure versus chemical fertilizers had different best management practices in terms of how they were applied, just because it seems like a variable between their content.
Yeah, so they actually don't. They're exactly the same for nutrient availability. Generally, farmers never broadcast manure. You can do it. You can broadcast and incorporate it. Manure will lose its nutrients a lot faster than chemical fertilizers will. So that's something to consider about. So usually most manure is injected into the soil. That's the one other thing that they can do differently. They can broadcast it, leave it on the surface, which is it's not recommended at all. You'll lose a lot of nutrients, and also the smell is terrible. So you'll have neighbors complaining and that kind of stuff. You can broadcast it and then incorporate it, but basically anytime that you're leaving it on the soil surface, you're losing those nutrients. And then basically instead of banding, it's still the same thing as banding, but you inject it into the soil. So you can inject it at different depths, but it's more or less the same thing.
Great, and we actually do have a question. This one's from Alex. They're asking if water content of fertilizer has an effect on nutrient runoff.
So generally in an agricultural production system, so not greenhouses, but basically all the fertilizer we use are granules. So there's basically no water content in them. You can use a water-based spray, but that would only be if you were fertilizing in the middle of the season. And I'm not sure how common that would be in Ontario. We generally don't do that here. So it would have an effect on nutrient runoff, but it's not really a concern for us because it's mostly all granular fertilizer. The problem you might get into, though, is if you apply the granular fertilizer on the surface, you don't incorporate it, and then it rains, you could have a big nutrient runoff there.
Does that answer your question, Alice? You can just type it in when you're ready. And if there are any other questions, now is the time. We do still have about 10 minutes with Lindsey left.
There's another question here. If you don't want to fertilize, would a rest period rejuvenate the soil sufficiently? No, it would not, because you're not adding anything into it. So basically, we used to do, it was called summer fallow. That was mostly to try and build up moisture on the prairies. That was oftentimes done in the 30s, I guess, during the Dust Bowl period. They would do summer fallow to rest the soil. But basically the end conclusion of this was they ended up losing more than they would gain. So you would have the nutrients would be either running off or leaching through the soil. Not a huge deal during the Dust Bowl, but you would have erosion if you left if the soil was bare. You'd have things just flying off the field. You really need to have plants to kind of capture those nutrients and then return them to the soil. So if you didn't want to fertilize, per se, if you were in organic production, what a lot of they'll do is they'll grow, it's called green manure. So basically they grow a crop. It's usually going to be something like a forage or like a clover or something like that. So not a food crop. They grow it and then they actually just till it back into the soil. So the crop, and it works really well with deep-rooted crops. If you do something like alfalfa, that alfalfa has a lot deeper roots than what I said, than those 60 centimeters. They can go 90 centimeters, 100 centimeters. They can go pretty far down. So that alfalfa crop will pull up the nutrients from lower in the soil profile, make those available to the next plant after you till it all in. So generally a rest period is not recommended. There's other methods that are much better for doing that. Green manure or cover cropping are pretty good.
Right.
All right.
Also wrote a question. He asked, how fast does the nitrogen cycle replenish soil nitrogen? Is there a standard time frame or not?
No.
I guess.
It's very slowly. There's a few different, I'm trying to remember, there's a few different kind of categories of soil nitrogen. So there's the one that's immediately available. There's one that's kind of more slowly available, and then there's one that's very, very slowly available. So it really depends on where you're getting the nitrogen from. So most nitrogen in a cropping system is going to be from decomposition of organic matter. So actually what happens is when you first have decomposition of organic matter, the microorganisms in the soil, they eat and incorporate all that nitrogen into their own bodies. So you actually get a decrease in nitrogen right after you've added nitrogen in organic matter to the soil. Then when those microorganisms die, then that nitrogen is released. So there's a lag period there. And that can usually take about like one growing season for that to happen. So sometimes if you add a lot of residue into the soil right before you plant your crops, you're actually decreasing the amount of nitrogen available to the plants. So other ways that nitrogen ends up in the soil is through microorganisms that take dinitrogen gas and they convert it into nitrate and nitrite, which is available to plants. That really depends on your soil and how many organisms that you have in that soil and what kind of crops you've been growing. So things like soybeans, they are very good. The microorganisms that associate with them are very good at converting nitrogen. And then also another common way that we can get more nitrogen in the soil, although if someone would like to try and harness this, it would be great, is lightning actually. When lightning strikes the atmosphere, the dinitrogen gas gets turned into nitrate, and that will fall onto the field. But good luck trying to control that and getting enough nitrogen on your field through that. I guess maybe if you put a bunch of poles up, some metal poles, you might be able to get enough nitrogen. I wouldn't recommend that as a practice, but I can't give you a timeline on that, unfortunately.
Sounds like it varies is kind of the...
It really varies on, on the...
Are there any other questions? I went through mine.
Here we go.
We have another one from Lisa. So if farmers are planning to adapt to climate change, is soil fertility different in northern locations?
That's a really great question, because a common kind of misconception that people have is with climate change, it's great. We can farm in more northern areas, right? That opens up a whole new agricultural area for us. It's perfect. But that soil has been frozen for like millennia, I guess. We'll be ready to farm there, like people will be ready to farm there, and the climate will be ready for farming, but the soil won't be. The soil will take a really, really long time to catch up. It has very, very low nutrient status because it didn't need all those nutrients. When you think about the plants and things that grow up north, there's not a ton of growth going on there. They have a very short growing season. So if you want to move into those northern areas to start farming, you would have to put in a lot of inputs, a lot of fertilizer, a lot of organic matter, all kinds of things. So the soil, it will not be ready for farming, even if the climate is or the weather is. Does that answer your question?
A little further north, even or further south, in terms of say Northern Ontario, the soils tend to be more acidic, correct? And a little rockier. So
yeah. So what with Northern Ontario, I'm actually at basically the same. I'm in Carberry, so we're basically on the same latitude as Northern Ontario, but we have completely different soils. So Ontario, Northern Ontario, I always find it funny when people say Northern Ontario because I always think it's the north, but Northern Ontario and Southern Manitoba are the same. You're right on the Canadian Shield, so your soils are very shallow. You have a lot of conifers, and conifers are more acidic plants. So all of your organic matter is acidic. You get very acidic soils. When you look in Manitoba, Southern Manitoba, we're more of a grassland environment. So we have grasses, they're great. We have really, really deep soils, really good A horizons. So we are much better for farming, suited for farming than the kind of the Northern Ontario region. However, when you move up north in Manitoba, it's not even in the Arctic, but you're kind of hitting the same boreal forest / Canadian Shield that you run into in Northern Ontario. So you'd run into the same kind of issues that you have in Northern Ontario when you get into more Northern Manitoba, because it kind of goes like, that's Northern Ontario, kind of goes like up like this through Manitoba.
So a lot of this kind of comes back to the parent material of the soil.
Yeah, we have different parent material as well as slightly different climate. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone has one. I'll just let it hang out there for a minute, and I will mention that we do have a short survey, so if you have any feedback, we would love to hear it. I'm just throwing it up on the link to it on the chat feature. I'll just send it to all.
Mm-hmm. And if you have other questions that you think of later, I don't know if you can contact Allison potentially, and then she can contact me if that works for her.
Yep, that would work. Yeah, any questions can get filtered through me. And Lindsey, if you share the PowerPoint, it's something that I can give out to our list. And we are recording this session, so it will be edited and posted as a video to watch at people's leisure.
Yep.
So it looks like for the most part, I'm not getting any more questions. Lisa feels like you answered all of hers. Good job. She was asking some stuff. So if that's that, I'm going to say it's a late enough evening that we can call it a wrap. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, and Lindsey, thank you for your expertise. We do appreciate the experts coming in to provide insight, because if it was me, it would be a much shorter, less informative session. All right, so I'll end the meeting now, and I'll be reaching out after. If you have any comments, though, send them to me or answer that survey monkey. Right, have a good night, everyone.